Okay. All right. So, hi everyone. I just wanted to quickly introduce myself before I kind of open things up. My name is Madison or Maddie Allen Lee. I'm the graduate assistant at the Office of Fellowships, and I'm also a fifth year PhD candidate in the Screen Cultures program in the Department of Radio, TV, Film. So my primary role here today is to just be a facilitator for our wonderful panelists, the presidential fellows, to answer questions that you all may have about graduate school, the process of applying, making that decision. But if folks have particular questions about, PhD in humanities programs, I'll stick around after kind of the 1 hour mark, and I'm happy to jump in and answer questions too, or just chat more informally after the event. So, stick around and please feel free to ask me anything if it comes up. But yeah, I'm really here to kind of, function as the host here. So I'm going to start us off by asking a few kind of questions, just some basic questions about how folks decided to go to grad school, how they picked their program, etc. And I think around like the halfway mark, my goal is to try and open things up to attendee questions. So at any point, if folks have questions, even right now, please don't hesitate to drop them into the chat. So if you think of anything at any point, or somebody's answer brings up another question, just drop it in the chat, and I will do my best to interweave those questions too. Okay. Again, just so everyone knows, this meeting is being recorded, just for folks who couldn't be here, and it will be available on the Office of Fellowships website. So yeah, before I ask folks to introduce themselves, I want to turn things over to my wonderful colleague, Beth, and ask you to introduce yourself, Beth, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So I'm Beth Pardo. I direct the Office of Fellowships, where we have the great wisdom to bring Maddie on for a graduate assistant year and help students individually and in groups and organize this fabulous event. I will say this event is one of my favorites of our annual calendar. It has been going on now for nearly 15 years in some form or another. This is a signal both of how deeply invested the Office of Fellowships is in the Presidential Fellows Program writ large. For those of you undergrads who are either in this call or watching it down the line, and the Presidential Fellows are selected from across the university for their capacity to work across disciplinary boundaries. So you have a set of folks here who are remarkably good about talking about their work to folks who are not experts in it. And they have a wide array of life experiences. And every year I get some wonderful note back after this event about how profoundly grateful the undergraduates are to hear about what it is to live life as a graduate student and the many forms that life can take. That there is not just one path to and through graduate school. You can do all sorts of things in all sorts of ways with all sorts of people and family constellations. So I want to keep my remarks short, other than to say I'm deeply grateful that the Presidential Fellows have joined us again. I'm delighted with how many students have responded to this invite, either by coming today or asking for the recording. And with that, Maddie, let it rip.
Thanks, Beth. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and call on folks based on the order of my little Zoom grid, just for efficiency. And if you could please just introduce yourself, your name, pronouns, maybe a brief description of your research, or maybe just something that you're finding particularly compelling or inspiring about your work right now these days. Yeah, that would be great. So I'll hand things off to Rachel if you'd like to start.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Russell. I'm a sixth year in the interdisciplinary PhD in theater and drama, also known as IPTD. I'm a dance scholar and a dance practitioner. And my work primarily focuses on Black women in dance at the intersection of modern dance and African diasporic dance, using dance to think about life and using dance to think about potential futures, and ways of living and being that are oriented towards liberation. And right now I'm in Baltimore and have had the wonderful privilege to be able to reconnect with the company I dance with professionally, as a part of doing the research for the work, which is taking many twists and turns. So I'm actually doing ethnography, but I've also been pulled in to dance the work, which has been grounding and adding additional information that I'm excited to like pour back into the project. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Bright, would you introduce yourself?
So my name is Bright Gemfie, and I'm in the history department in my 6th year. And my research, broadly speaking, I'm interested in African intellectuals who radicalized and transformed the study of Africa across intellectual centers around the Atlantic. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks, Bright. Thomas?
Hi, everyone. I am a 6th-year PhD student in the Center for Robotics and Biosystems, which is housed in mechanical engineering. And I like to study the ways in which self-organization can enable, facilitate, or improve control and learning of robots or robotic systems across scales. Basically, this is like taking lessons from nature and how to make things smart at the smallest scales, but also at the biggest scales. Lately, I've been working on using theories of self-organization to accelerate reinforcement learning, which is exciting to some of you maybe. And I'm excited to talk to you about what it's like to do a STEM PhD.
Thanks, Thomas. Ricky, do you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ricky Bird, she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a PhD candidate in the now Black Studies department. We used to be African American Studies. We changed our name last week to Black Studies. My project looks at the way that Black people perform mourning through clothing and textiles. So I look at everyday practices such as rest in peace t-shirts, and t-shirts used within the movement for Black lives, as well as a handful of visual arts and performance art from artists across the Black diaspora. I'm currently working on my chapter on rest in peace t-shirts that has a lot of movement. On the one hand, I'm situating them within this broader art historical kind of this art historical realm around Black portraiture and the ways that the t-shirts use photography. Also doing a little bit of unexpected work around hip hop and post-mortem photography, since that's when these t-shirts kind of come into existence during the mid to late 1990s. So going along the journey as research kind of takes you on, and it's really exciting right now.
Thanks, Ricky. Jacob.
Hey everybody, my name is Jacob Kelter, is he, him pronouns, and I'm in the joint computer science and learning sciences program. So what that means is I use computers for learning or education. And specifically, I'm doing science education with the material science department here at Northwestern. And so I'm helping to redesign their introductory course to use computational modeling to help the students learn about that material. And then I study student learning. So then I'll like interview students, try to understand their thought processes. So there's like a cognitive science aspect there as well. Yeah, I guess that's it for now. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jacob. Sheridan?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sheridan Fuller. I'm a 6th year in human development, social policy programming, specialty. I use he, him pronouns.
Sorry to interrupt. You're a little bit spotty. I don't know if that's just on my end or other folks are having trouble. Just speak a little closer to the mic.
How does this sound? Is it better?
A little better. It does sound, yeah, it sounds a little like you're underwater.
Yeah, let's see here. Um, I'll try to just speak a little bit louder now. My name is Sharon Fuller. I'm in the Human Development and Social Policy program. I'm a sixth year, and I use he, him pronouns. And my research is around children and families' interactions with income support programs. So there's specifically two threads to that. One is what are the long-term impacts when children get access to the income support programs early in life? How does that impact their developmental trajectory? And then the second thread is not just what does it mean to get access to these programs, but how do policies that are racially linked, linked to politics around the New Deal and Southern Democrats and controlling who can and cannot access those programs, and what are the consequences for those policies, not just on who accesses the programs, but on children's long-term outcomes. And so, yeah, happy to chat with everyone about their research, their interest in grad school, and what some things to consider.
Thanks, Sheridan. All right, well, obviously, as everyone can tell, we just have such wonderful panelists with an incredible diversity of research and interest. So I'm really excited. Thank you all so much for being here again. So maybe we'll just dive right in. And the first question that I have for you all is a pretty obvious one, which is just kind of, you all might, or whoever wants to, speak a little bit about how you decided to go to grad school and how you selected your program. Yeah, I'll just open it up for that sort of intro question.
I'm happy to speak to, I guess, the experience of many engineers, probably. I think engineering undergraduate school kind of sets you up for a practical kind of a corporate-driven career. So, I don't know, big tech kind of dominates where most people tend to go to in my fields. And so the decision to go to graduate school kind of stems from either wanting to do, research or advance things at those big tech companies, or from rejection, I guess, of that path entirely. And so personally, what I did throughout my undergrad, I did a lot of different internships at several different tech and aerospace companies. And I kind of found out that the sort of like day-to-day of corporate tech engineering life wasn't really for me. I was kind of more interested in asking deeper questions, and decided that at a minimum, a PhD would be the next step for me. And I've since decided that I want to stay in academia for long term, but uh, uh, either way, a PhD facilitates asking those questions.
I guess I can jump in. So for me, it was after my freshman year in undergrad that I decided to pursue a PhD in history. I took a history class on African history, and not prior to that, not taking an African history class. So I was very fascinated about the things that I was learning. And also, I was able to do research when I was an undergrad. I traveled across Ghana, the UK, Trinidad, and elsewhere. So that desire to then continue was what cemented my decision to pursue a PhD in history. And I chose Northwestern because Northwestern has the biggest archival collection in Africa in the country. It has trained a number of scholars who work on Ghana and Africa in general, and is the number one program. It's been the number one program for decades. So that's why I decided to pursue Northwestern. And
I can jump in. I think for me, my path was a little, I couldn't imagine it as an undergrad. I think in undergrad, I have 3 degrees in 3 different subjects. So my first degree is in journalism. I had big dreams of moving to New York and working for a fashion publication. And that didn't pan out. But in my senior year, I had an independent study with a historian as a part of my Black Studies minor, and really became fascinated with research, and that there was kind of this wealth of knowledge that could be developed around at the intersection of Black studies and fashion studies. And so I took a year off, and then I went to get my master's degree in fashion studies in New York, and really was ingrained in research, but also really enjoyed my time as a TA, a teacher's assistant, when I was getting my degree. And so I ended up taking a job to teach at a university back home in St. Louis, and kind of was able to sink my teeth into the idea and the fact that I think I want to be a professor. And to do that, I wanted to go back and get a PhD to both strengthen my research, but to explore the field of Black studies, I think a bit more, since I didn't have an actual degree in it. And so my choice of Northwestern was both practical and a love for the city of Chicago. I grew up coming here a lot, and wanted to come here for my undergrad to study journalism. And so it just felt like it was finally time for me to make that move. And then practicality, my family lives in St. Louis, and Chicago is close enough to get back home to my family. So yeah, sometimes you make decisions on both spectrums. So just wanted to be transparent about that as well.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Sure, I'll jump in. Yeah, I did my undergrad at Northwestern also, and I took a course with the professor who's now my PhD advisor. And it was basically like my favorite course I'd ever taken. I felt like it was just a very profound learning experience for me on this type of computational modeling that I now do, called agent-based modeling. And then I took another course with him on designing tools for thinking and learning, which was also one of my favorite courses. So I had a very sort of direct path of, like, I took those courses, they were super interesting. I still didn't immediately decide to do a PhD. I went and did other things for about 3 years. But I always had in the back of my mind that maybe I'd want to come back and do that. And so then I ended up at the same place because, like, my advisor's work was the work I wanted to do, and I didn't find equivalent. There are other people doing similar things, but I couldn't find anybody else doing exactly the same thing or have this joint program of computer science and learning sciences. So it was a sort of very specific situation in my case. All things being equal, I would have preferred to go somewhere else to see another part of the country. But the lab I wanted to be in, outweighed that.
Yeah, I wonder, kind of just what you said, Jacob, and Ricky mentioning sort of picking a place that was close to home, or, reasonably close. Were there other sort of reasons, or in hindsight, maybe factors that folks wish they would have maybe thought about when choosing a program, outside of perhaps just the research, and kind of additional factors that folks did consider or wish they had?
I can kind of jump in. My answer here is a little bit quick. So for context, I used to work at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and so my decision to go back to grad school was more so seeing who was having policy influence in the department. So usually there's two sets of skills folks have. They are folks who know process and personnel, and so they know the players, they know who they can contact with. The other set of folks are have expertise on the programs that are being administered by the department. And so I wanted to be someone who had spent a couple of years knowing the process and wanted to match that with research to have a particular kind of comparative advantage and insight. And so, looked at Northwestern because my advisor does a lot of work on the type of research when it comes to core programs, specifically SNAP and food stamps, and I was interested in doing those in the programs I worked on. One reason I looked at Northwestern was honestly the stipend. So when you go to grad school, you need to be able to live. And you could go to places like Boston, you can go out in California. Those are very high cost of living areas. And so your stipend is not going to stretch very far. And if you want to have any semblance of a life that's not just only in the books, you need to be able to pay your rent, food on the table, and maybe have a little bit of money to explore the area that you're in. And so Northwestern provided that kind of balance where Chicago is obviously not the cheapest place to live in the world, but is reasonable compared to other major cities. And the stipend, although folks are advocating for larger stipends, and understandably so, is still comparatively high given the cost of living. And so that was one factor that was important for me, given that I was used to a job, used to a salary. I joke and say had big boy bills. I needed a stipend that could ensure that I was able to meet those needs. And so, amongst other things, that was one thing that factored into my decision making.
I'll jump in. The stipend was also important for me as well. After I didn't go straight through. I was told actually in undergrad, like you at least have to take a year off. And when people who care about you tell you to do things, from like a deep place of love, I listen. So I lived in New York, worked, danced, and then eventually did my master's in performance studies at NYU. And I told myself, knowing that, there are PhD programs that have stipends where you don't have to, you get tuition, you get a stipend. I was like, I cannot pay for my PhD. I can't afford that. And so I got two strong offers for schools for, continuing to do the PhD. One, I was offered a presidential fellowship coming in, and like as much aid as possible that would have, dropped the out of pocket costs, but because of the area of where that school is located, and it's very far from my family, I've had to just weigh the cost of going that far. I would have had to find a way to support myself even with all of the aid that was offered. And then also being very far from family was something I thought about. And like Chicago's not close for, my family's primarily on the East Coast. Chicago's a flight away, or as I learned during the pandemic, a 12-hour drive, which it's doable when it's necessitated. But just thinking about, okay, where will I be able to survive and thrive and have access to dance? Be able to live and hopefully like save a little bit if possible, and then like be in community or quick access to community is important.
Anyone else want to jump in on reasons that they, wanted to choose either Northwestern or sort of the particular program? Not, we can
I'll,
also.
I'll
Yeah.
quickly add, so normally the stipend issue, so I think that this is normally more common in humanities sort of fields, right? That PhD positions are offered unfunded. But I just wanted to point out that this also happens in STEM fields. Some of the offers I got during my grad school application process were unfunded. And I would try to avoid that as much as possible, because at the end of the day, you really do have to just kind of live by yourself and be an adult, functioning adult, doing things. PhD is many things, but it's also a job, and you should be able to live off of it.
I think, Thomas, you bring up a really good point too, which is, in talking about deciding whether or not to go to graduate school, obviously, the folks here on this panel are PhD candidates. So I don't know if folks want to talk about how they, if you did do a master's beforehand, the, you know, the reasons to do a master's versus doing a PhD. When, you know, how did folks make that decision, if they did? Yeah.
I'll jump in and I'll answer. I'll just touch on the questions in the chat also. I'm sure other people have thoughts on that also. First, I'll share something that I heard from a philosophy professor, which is not my field, but a philosophy professor here at Northwestern tells his undergrads that they should only do a PhD if they literally can't help themselves from thinking about philosophical questions. He's like, if you're in the shower and you like can't stop yourself from thinking philosophy, then maybe you should do a philosophy PhD. Philosophy is maybe somewhat extreme because of like how competitive it is and that there aren't really philosophy jobs outside of academia. But I think the general point I like largely agree with. Like, yeah, I totally agree with the comments about stipend and like you should be able to live during a PhD. But even if you have a decent stipend like at Northwestern, there's probably a big financial opportunity cost compared to any other job that you're going to be doing. So basically, you don't do a PhD if your main motivator is making money, which if it is, like, that's totally fine. But yeah, you don't do a PhD to get rich. So you have to have like some intrinsic interest in the thing that you're doing. And so yeah, I did take some time off, partly because I was working on something else that I wanted to see through, and for some other reasons as well. But so I feel like if you have other interests, potentially it's worth going and checking those out for a couple of years at least. And then you can always do a PhD afterwards. And especially if you haven't, because you've spent your whole life, if you're an undergrad right now, you've basically spent your whole life in school. And so I think it's good to get a little perspective before deciding to do another 5 or 6 years in a PhD program. But there are cases where people are just absolutely sure that that's what they want to do. And so, you know, that works for those people as well. Just to touch on these questions in the chat, PhDs, R&D. So like basically, if you want to do PhD style research, more fundamental style research, most of those jobs in industry also require a PhD. So like you can get R&D jobs in industry without a PhD, but probably you'll be doing lower level stuff and not as much the thinking about the ideas like you would in a PhD. That said, it's not, you won't necessarily get paid more, but like if you're in a lab, you probably would. But like if you're at Google, let's say in computer science, and you're a researcher, you're not necessarily getting paid more than somebody who got a master's and is a software engineer. So it's like it's about the type of work you want to do, not the amount of money that you'll make. And then how common it is, I've met lots of people both in terms of starting a PhD right out of undergrad or taking time off in between. So they're both pretty common. My strong recommendation is to take a couple of years off. Other people might disagree with me.
I'll also quickly touch on these STEM questions while we're at it. I wanted to say also that for the difference of doing research in a PhD and an industry, right? Let's say that you do actually have the ability to do research in industry, either with or without a PhD, doesn't really matter. I think what's really important to note is that both the questions that you get to ask and the direction of the research program that you're engaged in are sort of like fundamentally of a different nature. In an industry sort of position, it's quite rare that you just get to ask a research question that doesn't lead you, towards some sort of product related outcome or like technologically related outcome. Whereas, it takes sometimes years of just randomly exploring ideas before you can find an application for some of the things that I get to work on here at Northwestern, right? Like seeing a connection between self-organization and artificial intelligence is not something that immediately seems product capable from, I guess the perspective of like 3 years ago in my PhD. Now that I've been able to like work on it over the course of 3 years and like develop it, I've been able to take these ideas that are super abstract and don't obviously have an application and find an application. But if I had been in a research lab industry, I don't think people would have had the patience for those 3 years. And so like the questions that I would have focused on would have been more applied in nature. And that's an important thing to consider. And then similarly, I agree with Jacob that it's very common to have either people that start their PhDs right after undergrad, which I did. And it's also totally common to have people that take off time between. I'll say that it is a challenge, right? So Jacob's saying he's recommending taking a couple of years off, and I totally get that, because the mindset has to be kind of different from the mindset that you have when you're an undergrad. It's not so much, I'm following this set of classes, I'm doing these homeworks, and I'm, when you're in an undergrad, you're kind of like railroaded onto this like path that you go through, you're done, you get your degree, and the rest of your life is ahead of you. Whereas a PhD is a lot more directionless, I guess, inherently, or rather, no one's going to give you that direction. You kind of have to make it for yourself. Hopefully your advisor helps you as well, but it's a different experience, and adapting to that new kind of experience takes a bit of intellectual and emotional maturity that it you need years of life to just sort of understand.
I would to chime in. I think maybe on 2 points for the NPP, master versus PhD. Like I had the NPP before coming back again, and I think to me, the main reason I did it was like, what skill sets do you want, and what skill sets do you need for whatever career that you want to pursue? And to me, I think that should be a key determining factor. Because like I said, if you don't need the PhD, there's no need to sacrifice your earning potential, the need to move, the stress. There's no need to do all of that, especially if a master's can get the job done. One thing to consider though is that like most of the time your PhD will be funded or free, and other times if your master's will pay for it. So there's like a cost calculation. If anything, I tell my friends now that if you're going to pursue a master's within the context of a PhD, and then make the decision after you've completed the master's. And then if it's no go for you, the master's was free. So that's like one, I guess you could say, cheat code that I tell like close friends of mine. There are risks to doing that approach, I say that from a financial piece. In terms of like the start now versus wait, to me, I think it's the main piece here, or two factors here are, particularly for the social sciences, you're spending 3 or 4 years thinking about a particular question and how to tackle and contribute knowledge around that question. Most of the time, you need to have had some experience to think about what is that question you want to answer. And oftentimes, you just need to have worked in a particular space or to have particular life experiences to be able to really focus, think, and say, okay, this is what I care about, and I'm ready to spend 3 or 4, 5, 6 years thinking about this one question and contributing knowledge to it. So you better be pretty damn sure what that question is before you start. And one way to be sure about that is to spend some time in that space, in a space near that. The other thing I think also is to think about, there's the other trade-off though is like efficiency and where you are. So like I went straight through undergrad to my master's, which allowed me to accelerate career, earnings, life things. But at the same time, I didn't have the full insight about the policy spaces I wanted to be in. I only came from work. Now, if I had taken time off, it would have delayed like what kind of earnings I could have had to do the things, to live the life I want to live. And so I think that's another trade-off of like, if you go right away, you're going to be able to do things earlier, graduate earlier, get the job, if you want to go in academia, get an academic job earlier, kind of start your life earlier. But it comes at the cost of like, you might not know what you want to do earlier. So, and delaying it means like, okay, you've had some time to solidify what you want to do, but then that also comes with you're delaying all the things of life. So you may be delaying getting married, you may be delaying kids, all those other things because you want to wait until you're stable to do those things. And so they're just not just from what are you going to do in school kind of things, but what are you going to do in life? And if you go get a PhD, you're kind of going to be unstable for a longer period of time, essentially, than if you like go straight through. What does that mean to be dealing with those things at 26, 27, 28 versus like 30, 31, 32, 33? Those are important things you want to kind of think about on the front.
To jump in, I really agree with Sheridan. I think it's important to think about the research question that animates you to sustain you for a long time, because it's a long journey. I mean, for me, like I said earlier, because I knew I wanted to become a professor, the research question that I've been sitting on has shifted here and there, but in terms of the core of it has not shifted. It has been something I've been working on for the last 10 years. And because I knew I wanted to take this path, I applied straight for a PhD program. And I got into Northwestern, which was my #1 choice. But then my advisor was going to be on leave. So I decided to take a year off because he advised me to take a year off. And at that time, because I applied for both master's and PhD programs at the same time, I had a scholarship to go to Oxford. So I just spent a year at Oxford, but also really thinking through the project that I wanted to do, the same kind of project. And it allowed me to also build different sets of networks. Because by going to Oxford, when I was on the job market, I got people at Oxford to write my letters of recommendation, as well as I always have visiting scholar opportunities at Oxford as well. So I'm always in and out. So I think it's important, if you can take time to just really think through certain things, is always helpful.
Anyone else want to jump in on this? Oh, Ricky,
Oh, I was going to respond to the question in the chat, but I can wait.
Yes. Go for it.
Yeah, so as far as developing a list of schools, so it's, I don't know, there are so many moving parts to this because everyone's experience is different. And so there's a situation where like you have your ideal school that you want to go to, and you have two schools that you want to go to and you apply to them and you don't get in. That happens a lot. It's I will say it's rarely a reflection of you personally or your research question. To Bright's point, right? It might be that the person that you want to work with won't be there anymore, or they haven't even told their department that they're leaving, but that's why you weren't accepted, so on and so forth. It could be a reality that the graduate school at that institution doesn't have funding for enough students for that department that year. So it can be a variety of things. And so the advice that I received from my mentors was to just cast a wide net. If I knew I really wanted to go to grad school, to not just apply to 2 schools, even though, sure, I had my top 2 or top 3, but to cast a wide net to make sure, one, I ended up in a program, but to also hopefully make myself look competitive. So the hope that you get more than one offer, and similar to a job that you would get, in different industries, you could possibly use different offers to negotiate, et cetera. And so for me, my list of schools were dependent on a couple of factors. One, places that I was fine living in. That's a reality. Some people don't want to live in certain places or certain cities or certain towns for a variety of reasons. So it was shaped by that. It was shaped by the departments that I really wanted to study in. So I applied to American Studies programs and Black Studies and Africana Studies programs. It was dependent on the professors in those departments, as well as the type of research that was coming out of the departments, because I was doing research on fashion, and I knew I didn't want to go to a fashion school because I already had that degree. Really finding a program that could support a topic that isn't necessarily as not necessarily supported, but sometimes people have a difficult time kind of figuring out how they can provide support to certain topics. And so making sure that there were people in the department who could kind of nurture and support and mentor the type of research that I wanted to do. So those are some factors. And so I think I applied to 8 schools altogether.
I want to piggyback on that already excellent answer and say that something that's really important when it comes to your PhD happiness in general, or like something that will shape truly like your whole PhD, is who your advisor is, right? So do not take that choice lightly. They can either make the PhD experience just wonderful for you, or it could be a nightmare. You hear about both things happening. And so when you're doing your research, putting your list of schools together, it's always good to reach out to graduate students, trying to figure out what advisors are, known for being bad or known for being particularly supportive, either one. And usually graduate students are very happy to reply with you, very honestly. There's really no drawbacks to that. And in fact, I get reached out to very often by people outside of Northwestern who are considering joining our department.
I mean, to add to that too, I also think is if you're gonna go for a program, make sure that there's at least more than one persons who can supervise your work, because life happens, people move. I've had people who had left, whose advisors have left, and they're scrambling trying to find people who have the knowledge to really advise their work. So you always have an idea that at least there's one or two people I can rely on when, let's say, somebody moves. And then the other thing too, making my list, one of the things that I send an email to certain people whose research inspires me. And I asked them that, hey, this is my research. Do you have any recommendation for schools and programs to apply to? And I also asked certain professors, are they accepting students? So I don't waste my money. Because sometimes people will just apply, as Ricky was saying, and will not get in, not because they're not good, but people not accepting students. So I think these are things to really consider. And also looking at placement. I think placement is very important. I paid attention because I wanted to go into academia. I paid attention to the placement for the history department. Where are people going? Are they getting jobs afterwards? So these are certain things that I considered.
That still applies to industry too, I'll say. Like placement in terms of like companies, that's very important. And you can also see like in STEM programs, like where it is that people end up going. I think Northwestern's mechanical engineering department has actually like a website or a spreadsheet where you can see exactly where this happens. And so I recommend you check that out if like industry is what you're into.
This is something I want to add to some of the things that Bright raised about things to consider for your program, because I think the general rule of thumb is like for undergrad, you pick the institution, for a master's, you pick the program, for faculty, for a PhD, you pick the person. And so the person really plays a central role. And some things I would encourage you to think about. One is mentorship style. So I argue there's usually for social science, there's two models. One is an apprenticeship style, where you work on their work and you learn by observing, and then by observing, you can start doing your things. And then there's a model where they advise you on your work. So everything is about your ideas, and you generate the work, and they're just providing feedback and comments on your work. There are trade-offs to both. One is you get a chance to see and learn, but then the other is you're spending time advancing someone else's research that may not be exactly what yours is. But then the other is like, it's all your stuff. And so when it comes to writing letters and things like that, they're always talking about the things you did that you're the single author on. The other thing to think about is, are you going to be looking to work with someone who's junior, or are you looking to work with someone who's senior? Someone who's senior is going to have a lot of gravitas when they go to write their letters, and it's going to draw a lot of attention. Someone who's junior, but is, let me back up. The person with more gravitas, and they have less time. And that may affect how much time they can invest with you in terms of weekly check-ins or whatever it may be. Someone who's junior is probably going to be, they're closer to the experience you just had, so they have a lot of key insights. It's going to be maybe more relevant to what you're going through. They're probably going to be more willing to kind of contribute to advance your work, but they might not be as well known yet. So they're just that's another kind of margin to think about for grad school, like in terms of the advisor, because they're going to play such a central role. And then this also kind of connects to kind of experience. You may not yet know what kind of mentorship style you want. And so, I mean, that may be an unfair margin, and it's kind of another nod to think about, how, if you've had a job before, you've had a good supervisor, like, oh, I want someone who's like this, or you've had a bad supervisor, like, oh, I definitely don't want that experience again. And so that's something else to kind of think about.
I'd like to add a little bit about like thinking about how you find a program and like program names. So within dance, there are not a lot of options to get a PhD within dance or PhD within dance studies. And so there's a history of dancers and other, I'm sure other creative fields having to like, you end up finding yourself in creative homes. So there are people who are within dance studies who are in English departments, who are in American studies departments, who like all over. And so when you're looking for a place, you may find unexpected homes. So I would encourage you to like look for like, yes, the things that are, you know, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, look for the X, Y, and Z, but also think of where there may be other synergies or places that are excited to support you in your work, especially if you work interdisciplinarily, that are like open and excited to the fusion of ideas that you may bring, especially if there are not many places that have the name of what exactly you would like to do.
I guess I want to add to Rachel, this is such an important point. Like, I think because all of you have research that is interdisciplinary in some way, I don't know if this was a way that you went about, you know, deciding your programs, but I certainly, and I think this was mentioned earlier, but I definitely tried when I was choosing my program to talk to current graduate students in those programs, either through in-person visits or virtually. And I paid attention to what type of research they were doing, because I also was really interested in bridging different fields and working with a committee that was pretty diverse in terms of their interests. So yeah, all things to kind of consider. Talking to the graduate students, as I think maybe Thomas, you mentioned earlier, is just they're a wonderful resource, and usually folks are really happy to talk to you about their experiences getting their research up and running. Anybody else want to jump in here? We have about 10 minutes left until the
If I may also add just a bit, so people who are interested in applying for grad school, sometimes you can email programs and ask them if they have fee waivers, so you can save your money. For me, I did that. Some people said yes, some people said no. So it always allows you to expand your network as well.
I also had a thought as we were talking about these things. Prestige, the question of prestige in putting together a list of programs, whether prestige matters or not, right? That's a question that I'm sure, I mean, everyone that's applied to graduate school has thought about a good bit. And I guess the answer is that prestige, for better or worse, it matters in a lot of ways, right? It either opens up doors to you that wouldn't have been available before, or it makes people think highly of you, whether or not that's deserved or right. It's a separate question, but it kind of happens either way. And it's something for you to take advantage of if you really do have the opportunity to take advantage of this. Whether prestige matters to like later career outcomes, I'd say kind of depends on the career path that you're going on. I think everyone on this panel that's interested in the academic job market knows very well that prestige is quite important. But if you're not interested in the academic job market, it tends to, I mean, it's not that it doesn't matter, but it tends to sort of degrade more gracefully than for academic jobs. Yeah.
Amy, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So I guess my question is like, okay. My apologies, I'm just finishing up my question was, and this is, I don't know how to phrase this in the chat. Like, you go to your program, you do your research for 10 years, you love it, but I guess when you're getting your PhD or something that's so dedicated, how do you cope with, or maybe just manage your expectation for the fact that you might not always love it as much as you do in your program? You know what I mean? Like, as an academic, like, how do you consider the possibility of doing the same work for the rest of your life?
I mean, that's definitely a great question. Sometimes I get tired of talking about my research. You could be in one space, people would just be asking you the same thing. So I think it is perfectly normal to have a distance. So I try to have distance as much as possible for my work. I love soccer. I tend to play a lot of soccer, do other things, and not necessarily talk about my work constantly because you're human. You can't, I mean, when I was writing my dissertation, I spent so many hours a day. You just get tired. You just want to turn it in and just get it over with, and then the passion will come back whenever it's necessary. But I think, yeah, just having a distance like anything else. Yeah.
I like to say that a life is lived one day at a time. And so like you should make your day to day something that you enjoy. I think that helps a lot with this, right? Like, I mean, that includes like your work-life balance. It includes maybe exactly what questions you're researching or like how it is you go about doing your job, but it includes all the things that Bright is saying here, right? You should enrich your extra like work, life outside of work, like the most you can or the most you want to. And I sure try to do that. I play music. I listen. I go to a lot of shows. It's a big part of what I like to do with my friends as well. And whenever I'm hanging out with my friends outside of work, we don't talk about work. But you can have different ways of handling the situation as well.
Just gonna
There's a
in here
for
because
incoming students.
something that it comes back to some things that were said earlier in terms of this being a decision that you're making for yourself that is about your whole life, not just your intellectual life. So I will say something that is generally not expected, which is the best thing I did was have a baby while I was writing my dissertation, because I assure you my baby did not care about whether or not I'd gotten hung up on paragraph 3 of chapter 6 or not. And it was actually a really wonderful way for me to stay grounded in all the things that were important to me, not just my dissertation, which was important to me. And frankly, when I was a traditional professor bringing my sick kid to class, the students enjoyed the baby too as a distraction from things. So I did want to point out, because I don't think it got said expressly, it was said implicitly. And so for the undergrads on the call, you want to think about your image for your whole life. And when you're talking to those fellow graduate students, if you are someone who, say, was like I was at that point and knew that I wanted to start a family, knowing what that looks like in your program. I remember hearing about that from folks who were in my program and knowing what that looked like, and that my doctoral director was not someone who basically said, this is, admittedly, I'm old, right? Oh dear, a woman who's pregnant, you'd better leave the program, but was going to instead support me as I made those life choices. So it's, you've heard it in different ways from different people, and I just wanted to underscore outright that that is part of who you are and how you choose to live, and there are many ways. There are many ways to do it.
I think that's a great point, Beth. It's definitely something that I took into consideration when I was choosing my PhD advisor as well. And also kind of just to go back to the point about I was making earlier about talking to other graduate students. This was kind of a particular thing I tried to pay attention to, like, do graduate students in this particular program seem happy, like just quite generally, or do they have other interests outside of work? Since that was important to me. I'm also a musician. I have, other aspects of who I am that it felt important not to just let those things drop away. And in fact, in my case, I felt like the more I made space for those other activities, the richer my actual research got. So.
Yeah, I'd like to add, for me, my research and the work I do within academia is a product of my life and not the other way around. And I feel just so beautifully blessed to have just wonderful models within undergrad. So from Baltimore, I went to Columbia College Chicago, got my BFA in dance pedagogy. And I also did all the requirements for the BA in dance studies. But all of my teachers, everybody, showed up as their full selves. And so I did not understand anyone not showing up as their full self. And so like from the chair to, everybody, like I've babysat children, have supported external work and projects. So like worked as a production assistant or helping with research, invited to be in the room to do different things. When I did my master's, one of my professors did work with dance and dance studies, but then was also writing children's books. So I encourage people, as much as they feel comfortable and safe to do so, to show up as their full selves and like allow you and all of your brilliance and brightness to shine, and let that guide where you're going to go and what you want to do. And like do ask those questions of like, to figure out if you can show up as your full self, or like show up as the person you want to grow into within a program, within a space, if it'll be supportive of you in return. So, and also don't, it gets hard to like shift gears with like when you're doing the PhD project in particular, because of, the intricacies of it, but you may shift gears, or you may find some unexpected thing that comes up that like changes the direction in a way that is putting you more on the path that you may want to go down, or find like an odd synergy and like, oh, this whole new thing has emerged. So I hope that's helpful.
I want to just make sure, I'm mindful of folks' time. So we are approaching that hour mark. So I want to thank everybody so much for being here. Thank you so much to all the Presidential Fellows for taking the time to come here and share all of your wisdom and knowledge. I'm going to stick around just kind of informally, and I don't want to necessarily put a hard cap on this conversation, especially because there are still a few questions in the chat. So if folks want to stay around, have the time, stick around, we'll just keep this going for, if folks have more questions. Also, if any of the fellows would like or are comfortable with sharing their emails in the chat, maybe that would be another space students can reach out, got questions. I'll also stick my own contact information in there. But yeah, we're at 12:30. So if everybody needs to hop off, it's totally okay.
I have to hop off, but I want to express my thanks again to the Presidential Fellows for joining and being so willing to share your full selves, to quote Rachel's beautiful capturing of this scenario. So thank you so very much. And Maddie, I'm glad I saw I'm glad you're able to stay and get a couple of the questions that were left in the chat. Thank you again, and take care, everybody.